While the world argued about inflation numbers, election cycles, and distant wars, something far more important happened in near silence. Over $5 trillion quietly moved across global balance sheets, out of sight of headlines and far away from public debate. No emergency meetings, no breaking news banners, just capital doing what it has always done before moments of systemic rupture, leaving early. This video asks a dangerous question few are willing to touch. Why does massive wealth always move just before collapse becomes obvious? Why do institutions, governments, and insiders reposition years ahead of crises that seem to blindside everyone else? The mainstream story tells you markets are resilient, systems are stable, and volatility is temporary. History tells a different story. Again and again, from ancient empires to modern superpowers, the warning signs were visible, but only to those who knew where to look. Wealth didn't disappear overnight, it slipped away quietly, methodically, while the public was distracted. What you don't understand about this $5 trillion shift could determine whether you protect your purchasing power or watch it erode. This isn't conspiracy, it's pattern recognition. And once you see the pattern, you'll understand why this moment feels uncomfortably familiar today now. To understand why $5 trillion would move quietly now, you need to understand a cycle so old it predates modern economics. Every dominant power in history, without exception, has followed the same financial arc. Not because of bad leaders or moral failure, but because systems reward certain behaviors until those behaviors consume the system itself. The cycle begins with expansion. Productivity rises, trade grows, innovation flourishes. Wealth is created through real output: goods, labor, infrastructure. This is the healthy phase, when money reflects value. Rome built roads, Britain built ships, America built factories. Then comes excess. Success breeds confidence, confidence breeds leverage. Debt expands faster than productivity, elites gain influence, inequality widens, but growth masks the imbalance. Most people still believe the system works because for a while, it does. Next is financialization, the most dangerous stage. Wealth decouples from production and flows into assets, speculation, and paper claims. Money stops measuring value and starts extracting it. Empires don't collapse here, they appear strongest, markets soar, currencies dominate globally, critics are dismissed as pessimists. Finally comes the quiet part, capital flight. Insiders don't wait for collapse, they reposition. They convert claims into real assets, they move wealth across borders, systems, and currencies. Only after this phase does collapse become visible: currency debasement, social unrest, institutional failure. This is where history is brutally consistent. The public experiences collapse as sudden. Elites experience it as scheduled. Mainstream narratives focus on events: wars, elections, scandals. History focuses on flows. Who is moving capital? Where is it going? And more importantly, why now? This framework isn't political. It doesn't require predicting dates or disasters. It simply recognizes that incentives shape behavior, and behavior repeats across centuries. Empires don't fall because people stop believing in them. They fall because the math stops working. Once you understand this cycle, the present moment becomes clearer. The question is no longer whether something is wrong. The question becomes which stage we're in and who is already acting on that knowledge, because when trillions move quietly, they are never reacting. They are preparing. When Rome ruled the known world, its power felt eternal. Roads stretched across continents, legions enforced order, and Roman coinage was accepted from Britain to Egypt. To ordinary citizens, the empire appeared unbreakable. Yet long before barbarians reached the gates, Rome's elites were already preparing for a different future. As the empire expanded, so did the cost of maintaining it. Taxes rose, debasement followed. Silver content in Roman coins quietly declined as emperors funded wars and social programs they could no longer afford. Officially, Rome was strong. Unofficially, insiders saw the numbers. They understood that when money weakens, power eventually follows. Wealthy Romans began shifting assets out of liquid currency and into land, estates, and political favors. Senators secured provincial holdings far from Rome. Elites converted paper claims into tangible control over food, labor, and territory. Gold and land mattered more than loyalty to a currency being slowly diluted. The public didn't panic because collapse wasn't visible yet. Markets still functioned, armies still marched, bread still arrived. This is the critical mistake most societies make when studying collapse, expecting chaos first. In reality, decay shows up as subtle incentives changing beneath the surface. By the time inflation accelerated and tax burdens crushed the middle class, elite capital had already moved. Currency holders suffered, landowners survived. When Rome finally fractured, it wasn't because no one saw it coming. It was because those who saw it coming had already insulated themselves. History rarely records capital flight as drama. It records battles and emperors instead. But the financial record tells a quieter story. Wealth does not wait for confirmation. It moves when probabilities shift, not when headlines appear. Rome's lesson is uncomfortable because it is universal. Collapse is not an event, it is a process. And those with access to information, influence, and optionality always act first. Everyone else learns after the fact when choices are limited and losses are permanent. That same pattern will repeat wherever money is diluted, obligations grow, and elites quietly exchange fragile promises for durable control long before the public senses danger again and again across civilizations globally. When Britain stood at the center of the global financial system, its dominance looked permanent. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. London cleared international trade, and British banks financed continents. At the empire's peak, few imagined decline. Yet beneath the pageantry, capital was already quietly changing direction. By the late 19th century, Britain faced a familiar problem. Maintaining a vast empire cost more than its industrial base could sustainably support. Productivity slowed. Debt expanded. Returns at home diminished. Rather than collapse, the system adapted in a more subtle way. British elites began exporting capital. Money flowed to the United States, railroads in Argentina, mines in Africa, and infrastructure across the developing world. On the surface, this looked like confidence and global leadership. In reality, it was risk management. Insiders understood that the highest future returns were no longer tied to Britain's domestic economy or its currency. World War I merely exposed what capital had already priced in. Britain emerged technically victorious, but financially weakened, heavily indebted to the United States. The pound never recovered its former dominance. The empire didn't vanish overnight. It hollowed out over decades. To the public, decline appeared sudden and unfair. To financial elites, it was anticipated. Assets had been diversified, claims had been shifted, power adjusted quietly, while patriotic narratives reassured citizens everything was normal. This is the recurring illusion of late-stage empires. Strength is measured by symbols, flags, armies, markets, while weakness reveals itself through flows. When capital consistently seeks safety and yield elsewhere, it signals not panic, but foresight. Britain's story matters because it proves something critical. Collapse doesn't begin with defeat. It begins with reallocation. The empire was strongest when its money began to leave. By the time political reality caught up, the financial decision had already been made and history simply followed the balance sheets. This final lesson unsettles modern audiences because it removes blame and replaces it with pattern. Nations decline not from betrayal, but from arithmetic. Capital obeys incentives, not loyalty. When returns shift elsewhere, money follows first, and flags follow later, without warning, permission, or public debate ever. America's moment of dominance followed the same early pattern as Rome and Britain, but with 20th century scale. After World War II, the United States became the world's productive engine. It manufactured goods, rebuilt nations, and anchored global trade with the dollar. For decades, money reflected output. Wages rose alongside productivity. The system felt fair because it mostly was. Then the incentives changed. Beginning in the 1970s, production slowly gave way to finance. Factories moved overseas. Labor was replaced by leverage. Debt expanded faster than real growth, but the illusion of prosperity remained intact. Instead of building things, America learned to price them, trade them, and securitize them. Wealth increasingly came from owning assets, not creating value. This was not framed as decline. It was framed as sophistication, financial innovation, global leadership. The dollar's reserve status allowed the United States to consume more than it produced and export inflation outward. For a time, this looked like a cheat code. Markets soared. Credit was cheap. Asset owners grew exponentially richer. But financialization carries a hidden cost. When wealth concentrates in assets, society becomes fragile. Housing stocks and bonds inflate beyond what incomes can support. Debt becomes systemic. Any disruption threatens the entire structure because little real buffer remains beneath the paper claims. Mainstream narratives celebrate this era as efficiency. History recognizes it as a warning sign. Every late-stage empire believes it has transcended old limits. Everyone discovers that leverage only works until confidence breaks. By the 2000s, the shift was undeniable. Crises required bailouts. Central banks became permanent market participants. Money stopped being a neutral tool and became an emergency instrument. Each intervention postponed pain but deepened dependence. Stability was no longer organic. It was engineered. To the public, rising markets signaled success. To insiders, they signaled risk concentration. When returns come primarily from financial engineering rather than productivity, the system becomes extractive. Growth turns brittle. Small shocks demand massive responses. This is the critical context for understanding today. America did not suddenly weaken. It matured into the same stage Rome and Britain reached before them. Dominance masked fragility, confidence concealed leverage, and capital, always attentive to incentives, began searching for alternatives. Financialization is not collapse. It is the stage that makes collapse possible. It creates the conditions where wealth must move early, quietly, and decisively. Once you recognize this phase, modern events stop feeling random. They begin to look inevitable. China's $5 trillion move was not a single transaction, headline, or announcement. That misunderstanding is part of why so many missed it. This shift unfolded across years through reserves, trade settlements, commodities, and capital controls, each piece appearing technical, isolated, and boring. Together, they tell a very different story. First, China quietly reduced reliance on dollar-denominated assets, while increasing exposure to hard assets and bilateral trade arrangements. Energy, metals, food security, and long-term supply contracts replaced abstract financial claims. This is not speculation, it is insulation. When systems grow unstable, tangible inputs matter more than promises. Second, trade settlement began shifting away from centralized financial rails. More transactions occurred directly between nations, bypassing traditional clearing mechanisms. To mainstream observers, this looked like efficiency or diplomacy. Historically, it signals mistrust in existing structures. Empires lose leverage not when challenged openly, but when participants stop relying on their systems. Third, capital controls tightened internally while outbound strategic investment increased selectively. This seems contradictory until viewed through a historical lens. Late-cycle powers restrict domestic leakage while deploying capital where future returns appear more durable. Rome did it with land. Britain did it with overseas infrastructure. China is doing it with resources and influence. Crucially, none of this required panic. That is the most important point. Capital does not flee screaming. It reallocates quietly, patiently, long before public narratives shift. Markets can remain strong, growth can continue, headlines can stay optimistic. The move happens anyway. Western commentary often frames China's actions as aggressive, defensive, or ideological. History frames them as rational. When monetary systems become weaponized, politicized, or overextended, rational actors seek optionality. They reduce exposure to single points of failure. They trade yield for resilience. This is why the number matters. $5 trillion is not a hedge. It is a structural repositioning. It reflects long-term probability, not short-term fear. No empire collapses because of one decision. They weaken because many small, intelligent decisions point away from the existing order. To the average observer, nothing dramatic occurred. To students of history, everything did. When capital of this magnitude moves without announcement, it signals that the future is being priced differently than the present. The public is told stability is returning. Balance sheets reveal preparation. China's move does not cause collapse. It reveals expectation. It belongs to the same chapter written by Roman senators and British bankers centuries earlier. The names change. The mechanisms evolve. The behavior does not. And that is why this moment matters. Not because something has already broken, but because those with the most information are quietly acting as if something eventually will. Mainstream explanations always arrive after the decision has been made. When officials say a move was about diversification, risk management, or temporary adjustment, they are describing the story that makes sense to the public, not the process that actually drove the behavior. History shows that narratives follow capital, never the other way around. The hidden story is simpler and more uncomfortable. Large pools of money respond to incentives long before outcomes are obvious. They react to structural stress, not headlines. Rising debt burdens, politicized currencies, shrinking trust between institutions, and dependence on intervention change probabilities quietly. Capital responds by reducing exposure, even while public messaging remains calm. This is why the mainstream narrative always feels reassuring until it suddenly doesn't. Stability is projected because panic would accelerate the very dynamics leaders are trying to manage. So reassurance becomes policy. Markets are described as resilient. Inflation is framed as transitory. Reforms are promised just over the horizon. Meanwhile, balance sheets tell the truth. Central banks accumulate gold while dismissing its relevance. Trade partners build alternatives while insisting cooperation remains strong. Liquidity is injected repeatedly to maintain confidence, even as each injection reduces future flexibility. These are not contradictions. They are symptoms of late-stage management. Contrast this with the historical record. Roman officials blamed moral decay while elites bought land. British leaders promised imperial renewal while capital flowed to New York. American policymakers speak of soft landings while intervention becomes permanent. The language changes. The pattern does not. This gap between narrative and reality is where most people get trapped. By the time stories shift from reassurance to urgency, options have narrowed, costs rise, mobility declines, decisions become reactive instead of strategic. The uncomfortable implication is this: you are never meant to notice the move while it is happening. Public awareness would defeat its purpose. Capital depends on discretion. It moves through complexity, technicalities, and boredom precisely because attention lags there. Understanding this contrast does not require cynicism. It requires literacy. Once you stop asking whether leaders are telling the truth and start watching what money is doing, clarity improves dramatically today.